All right. So let me just jump right in. And there is a lot happening in the news. And so next week, as we approach the end of the year, I am going to actually try to do a kind of synthetic lecture, right? That this is what happened in 2023. 2024 is obviously a momentous political year with the new elections coming up. And so we will also look forward to the legal cases, the elections, the international turmoil that we're facing right now. And so I just want to say I've kind of spent most of the last 6, 7 sessions moving away from contemporary politics. Maybe that's a break. We get back into it every now and then, and it's not as if what we're talking about today is irrelevant. But having said that, one of the reasons for conducting this lecture series at this point in the year is really in anticipation of 2024, and frankly, in anticipation of what I think I and many anticipate will be a very trying year for democratic politics in the United States, another stress test of our democracy. And increasingly, it appears as if the courts are going to play a very important role. How well will the courts hold up to the challenges presented by Donald Trump and his long disregard for the law and norms, and the way in which that intersects and in many respects contradicts what at least a substantial portion of the American people seem to want from their president and their leadership. So the health of democracy, I think, is an essential topic for us to be discussing in the background, in the buildup, as we approach 2024. So with that in mind, just a brief review of framing themes. We've talked about this before. We haven't done it for a couple of weeks, that we have to choose between two approaches to reforming democracy in America, or at least which one seems to be the more promising of the two approach. Is one of them is to really focus on the Constitution, on the long-standing structures of American democracy and how we can make them work better for the 21st century, perhaps through reform. And that includes amending the Constitution, of course. We are proud to be the oldest democracy in the world, at least modern democracy. We are perhaps also hampered by the fact that our institutions have been around for so long and are so difficult to update, right? So that's one possible approach. A second possible approach would be to say, well, those creaky old institutions are perhaps less than ideally suited for the 21st century. But having said that, we also have new innovations, new experiments that have been conducted since then, and we might be able to better update our practice of democracy, not by reforming the old institutions, but by experimenting with new institutions and practices. Give me just a moment. You may be able to hear the phone ringing in the background. I'm just going to pick it up so that I can silence it. All right, sorry about that. And one of the things we've considered in the last couple of weeks is proposals for reform. And I'm going to keep going on that, but I'm going to try to provide today a little bit more background information that will help us to ascertain what has succeeded in the past and what might help us then to work better, to better determine what kind of reform will work going forward. I've also suggested that there is this long-term project in the United States, articulated in our Declaration of Independence and in our Constitution, and renewed, for instance, in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address or Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. It is a tradition of gradually realizing the promise of the revolution, of the Constitution, of the Declaration that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that we want a government of the people, for the people, by the people, that we believe that those propositions, although written on parchment 200 odd years ago, require ongoing efforts to actually realize them in a society that actually falls far short of those ideals, and that therefore ongoing efforts are necessary to, quote, democratize our democracy, and that the fact that we continue to refer to ourselves as a democracy, despite the deficiencies of the institutions through which we seek to realize that ideal, indicates an aspiration, but also a commitment to continue along that path of reform in the direction of a more democratic democracy. And that the fact that we have built into our institutions, into our culture, into our political self-understanding, ideals that are not yet realized, on the one hand, motivates us, and on the other hand, at many points also frustrates us. And so if democracy is realized not through a revolution or a constitution, but through a protracted struggle, one of the questions is, when is the tension between what we aspire to be and what we actually are? When is that tension constructive? When does it lead us to reform? When does it lead us to redouble our efforts to better realize the ideal in our actual practice? And when, alternatively, does it lead to frustration or forms of grievance that lead us maybe to look for somebody to blame for the fact that our institutions don't work the way we think they're supposed to, or perhaps even to give up altogether on the project of the gradual, incremental realization of a democratic ideal. And this leads us to try to drill down on who is actually likely to be a force for change, for positive, constructive change in particular. And I do want to emphasize, it seems especially important right now in the middle of the holiday season, that it appears that a majority of Americans have not given up on that ideal or that struggle, that they actually are on the side of creating a multiracial, post-traditional democracy that better empowers the people to use our institutions to secure our interests and to express our hopes and ideals for an inclusive, progressive future. But there is a substantial, vocal, mobilized, and in many ways empowered minority that is taking the opposite path. And so this is a dangerous moment for democracy in the United States. And one of my suggestions is that we have to hope, we have to do more than hope, we have to do our best to make sure that as the politics of a new presidential election begin to take shape in 2024, we don't neglect the long-term interests of our democracy. We have to hope that 2024 will be a good year for democracy, and that part of the way in which we express that hope is by demanding from our politicians, our leaders, the organizations to which we belong, each other, that we actually reaffirm our commitment to democracy. And what that means in practice is figuring out how to better institutionalize and practice democracy in the 21st century. So this is, as opposed to a review, a little bit just of new material to make this as concrete as possible. The promise of democracy, among other things, is equality, and fundamentally political equality, equal opportunity to influence political decision making, and to do so via participating in the formation of public opinion and perhaps also in decision making, right? And that doesn't mean I'm always going to prevail. That doesn't mean I'm not going to have to compromise. It doesn't mean we're going to reach consensus, but it does mean that I should have roughly an equal input into and influence on the outcome of decision making because I'm a citizen, not because I'm wealthy, not because I'm connected or powerful, but simply, certainly not because I'm white or male, but simply because I'm an equal citizen. By the way, equality probably also entails that the social and economic inequality we allow be restrained so that it doesn't undermine political equality. And then freedom in addition to equality, right? The idea that I get to effectively express my consent for or criticism of the policies that our country is pursuing, that I get to be able to see myself as autonomous in my own life. And I think that's extraordinarily important. I have sufficient control over the forces influencing my life that I can direct my life. And therefore, there's a tight connection between individual and social autonomy. I need to be able to use my political power to influence those forces that seem to be hemming in my individual freedom. And so I need to have some effective control over the social world. And I just want to say, right, this is part of what we learn. I think not just in the civics lessons in our schools, but also in the public culture of our society. And when it appears, boy, I don't have much influence over politics. Boy, inequality is rampant, and we're in a new Gilded Age. Boy, it doesn't seem to matter at all whether I approve or disapprove of, or I'm deeply frustrated by the legislative direction or drift of my society. And by the way, I'm increasingly hemmed in and constrained by social forces over which I seem to have no control. Then it is understandable that frustration, that grievance, that aggression build in our politics. Not that that excuses the worst form that those emotions take when they target vulnerable people, when they look for scapegoats, when they express themselves as nationalism and racism and a desire for authority that supposedly empowers the majority ethnic group. That stuff cannot be justified, but at least it can be understood by understanding the frustration of political values. Now, with that background, I want to just return for a moment to the two proposals for reform that we considered, the proposals from Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zablat in their book, Tyranny of the Minority. And I want to focus more on the diagnosis than the actual proposals. We spent a lot of time in the last 2 weeks on the actual proposals, but the diagnosis is that a majority of Americans have reconciled themselves to a multiracial democracy, to it being an increasingly post-traditional society, one in which gender norms are going to be more fluid, sexuality is going to be less binary and governed by heterosexual norms. And as opposed to that, open themselves, right, to the idea that we're going to be a multiracial, post-traditional democracy. But the Republican Party mainly has not gone there. And as a matter of fact, many white Americans have not gone there. And as you can see, we've become increasingly polarized around issues of race and immigration in our society. And what Donald Trump has successfully done is really bring everyone who resents the movement of our society in the direction of a more multiracial, multi-denominational, multicultural, and equal society for people who are gay or not conforming to traditional gender and sexual norms, that the resentment, the anger, the hostility to all those groups, Trump and increasingly the Republican Party as a whole is the home to the hostility. And because there are a lot of us, not a majority of us, but a lot of us who are threatened by these developments, angry about these developments, this has represented a successful electoral strategy, especially given the way our institutions in the Senate, in the Electoral College, in the Supreme Court amplify minority power. By the way, you may have seen just a couple days ago, the Wisconsin Supreme Court invalidated the most extreme gerrymandering of legislative districts in the United States for the Wisconsin Assembly and Senate. Then that's going to take effect for 2024, right? So there is some indication that in some of these very divided states, there's some success in pushing back against some of the institutions that amplify minority power. That's the kind of reform that Levitsky and Zablat point to. I'll just point out very quickly, right, that the previous diagram was drawing on the work of Liliana Mason and colleagues. And what they show is that we have become extremely polarized, that we increasingly view our politics as an existential threat, that is to say, an existential struggle where the other party represents a threat to our very democracy, our very way of life. And so we regard the members of the other party as a threat to the country, as evil, as animalistic, right? And I do want to suggest that just this level of radical partisanship and polarization in and of itself presents an intrinsic threat to democracy, not just because it gives rise to violent partisan attitudes, a willingness to use violence against the opposition, especially if they seem to be on the cusp of gaining power, but also because it means we have essentially surrendered the need to listen to the other side. If they are a threat, not fellow citizens, if they are evil, not just expressing their political point of view, if they are animalistic as opposed to fellow human beings capable of participating in public reasoning, then we don't need to listen to them. We don't need to hear them. We know in advance that we have to discount and disregard everything they say, and that is no longer democracy. This is a much more competitive, as opposed to a cooperative understanding of politics. This is a contest for domination. And at least the way I think about it, democracy requires, as opposed to that, that we dissolve domination by looking to figure out how we can persuade each other, and when we can't, how we can respectfully compromise with each other. And that's what makes democracy a superior form of government, a more legitimate, more fair, more just form of government. And in conditions of radical partisanship, that is no longer the case. And so I do think just this level of polarization is a threat to our democracy. And if Levitsky and Zablat have ways of forcing and I want to be as clear as possible, forcing the Republican Party to come into the 21st century and not the 21st century of populist politics, right? This is the final diagram I've shared with you that I'll reshare today, right? The Republican Party has become an extreme outlier in terms of its willingness not to respect democratic norms and its opposition to ethnic minority rights. It's up there with the far right politics, but please note, it's not in the United States alone. This is happening in many places in the world, but whereas many of these far right parties, some of them are in fact the dominant party in their country, but many of them are smaller minority parties. Our main conservative party has become a populist authoritarian vehicle in the last 8 to 10 years. And I just think we need to figure out, if we can, get the Republican Party to change course, how to do so. And that's Levitsky and Ziblatt's proposal. Make them compete, not just for a mobilized minority, but for majority vote, and they will have to change course. We've also looked together at Benjamin Page and Martin Gillen's work on, in particular, democracy in America and what has gone wrong, and their fundamental suggestion that the amount of money in our politics, with 1% contributing 40% of the finances, that means that the members of the 1% are, and I'm sorry, 1%, 0.01%, excuse me, they are contributing 4,000 times more per person than the average campaign contributor, right? Just obviously disproportionate influence. American politics has become a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, and the result is that average citizens appear to only have influence when their preferences coincide with the economic elite or interest groups, to put it differently. If their preferences don't coincide with those of the ultra wealthy or ultra powerful, they have no meaningful impact on the decisions that are made in their name, right? And so whereas Levitsky and Ziblatt concentrate on amplified minority power, Page and Gillen's concentrate on money and politics, and they suggest, right, that we have become this vastly unequal society with 1% of our population getting 30% of our wealth, the top 10% getting 2/3 of the wealth, the bottom 50% getting less than 3% of the wealth. And so that even if a politician like Joe Biden succeeds in passing legislation that is genuinely economically beneficial for many Americans in the bottom half of the population, nevertheless, they don't really feel that it has benefited them, especially if that coincides with a period of relatively rapid inflation. And so this means that as long as we are this unequal, and as long as our politics allow concentrated wealth to translate into disproportionate power, we are going to have a lot of resentment and anger coursing through our politics. So how to make sense of this? Is it wealth, or is it the amplified power of a minority? Is it the fact that we're in a new Gilded Age, and after Citizens United and kindred decisions, it is now the case that money walks and talks and everything else is pushed off to the side? Or instead, is there a problem with a minority getting too much power? And I want to pull back then from these two sets of political scientists and turn to another political scientist, but in many ways perhaps the dean of American political science, recently retired from Harvard University, where he literally was the dean of the Kennedy School of Government, Robert Putnam, who has written a number of influential books, some of which I've spoken with you about in the past. And today, what I want to do is contrast his first highly influential book with his most recently published very influential book. The book I'm going to start with is Making Democracy Work, Civic Traditions in Modern Italy. And it is interesting to think that Robert Putnam actually began his career studying not the United States, but Italy, given that he's written some of the most influential books on American politics over the last quarter century. But that is where he started. And then the upswing, how America came together a century ago and how we can do it again. And I really want to focus on the upswing because I think one way to get a better sense of what we should be doing here and now in 2024 is to figure out what we did well a century ago, 75 years ago, and whether there are ways to, if not replicate it, at least learn some lessons that should guide us in figuring out whether it's Levitsky and Zablat or Page and Gillens or the alternative approach, which frankly I tend to prefer, which is new institutions as opposed to fixing old institutions. So let's spend a little bit of time with Robert Putnam. And I'm going to start, as I say, with this book published in the 1990s, Making Democracy Work. And the first thing to notice is that Robert Putnam happened to be in Italy in the early 1970s when the Italian government decided to devolve a fair bit of authority, especially budgeting authority, but administrative authority as well, from national to regional authorities. And so this is a decentralizing reform experiment. The centralized government was highly corrupt, highly clientelistic. You had to find someone who knew how to exercise power, probably give them some money or promise them your loyalty, and then maybe you could get something done. And so the Italians eventually reformed in order to try to move away from a corrupt system of government. And what Putnam did, because he was there as these reforms were being passed, as he designed this comprehensive study. He got a lot of funding to do it. He went back multiple times over nearly 25 years to see how these reforms played out. He looked at it from a quantitative perspective, trying to actually measure the way in which the reform made or didn't make differences, but also qualitative, trying to do interviews and understand people's attitudes and beliefs about reform and its consequences, as well as historical and regional, really getting deep into the 1,000-year history of Italian politics and the really important variations region to region. And the central conclusion, and I think you don't need Putnam to tell you this, is that this experiment in democratizing Italian democracy, and remember, of course, that Italy was fascist in the middle of the 20th century. So in many ways, it's a society that has one of the original democracies, Roman democracy, and had democratic city-states in Venice and Florence in the Middle Ages in ways that inspired other countries to start experimenting with modern democracy. But Italian modern democracy is actually quite young. And this experiment to better democratize their democracy was a mixed success. It succeeded in some regions better than in other regions. In other regions, it actually, though was not a total failure, had very limited success. And one of the things that makes this, quote, a natural experiment is that the institutions that were implemented in each region were perfectly identical to each other. And the result is then you can see how identical institutional reform or innovation has different consequences depending upon the history, the regional differences, the cultural differences in each area. So the central argument is that differing civic cultures sustained by differing rates of civic participation and rooted in longstanding historical and political regional differences explain why the same institutions function differently in different regions. And I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on this, but I want to start with the lesson for us in the United States in 2024, and that is that reform does not succeed at the level of institutional change alone. Institutional change has to be met halfway by a supporting civic culture, by the attitudes and values, norms, and orientations of the people who are implementing that reform, reacting to that reform, participating in the institutions and the avenues for empowered participation that those institutions open up. And that in turn, civic culture doesn't come merely from the ideas in people's heads. It comes from the opportunities we have to develop cultural habits, mores, or mores, right? And of course, well, I shouldn't say of course, Putnam is inspired most significantly by the work of Alexis de Tocqueville and this idea that you can't just look at the institution in isolation. You have to look at the culture, at the mores, at the people who those institutions are intended for, is a central theme of Tocqueville's classic Democracy in America. So Putnam considers three stories about the cause of successful democracy. And the stories start with a basic model of democratic success. He suggests that democracy should be stable. It should not be subject to major threat in the form of people mobilized against it. It should be responsive. It should actually listen to what the people want and create opportunities for what they want to be translated into law and policy, and then it should be effective. Those laws and policies should be effectively administered in a way that means that they actually address the interests, needs, aspirations of the people as expressed through the democratic process, right? And so pretty straightforward definition of democratic defense, democratic success. And then he considers three theses to account for the difference in success in different regions in Italy. The first is a thesis of institutional primacy. Change the institution and the people will change. That our identities, interests, and strategies are shaped by political institutions. If that's correct, then the reform should be equally successful in all regions of Italy because all regions had the same institutional reform. That's not what happened, right? And so there's a, in a sense, clear refutation of one of the most influential theses in contemporary political science. Second thesis is historical primacy. Institutional reform is limited and conditioned by prior institutional history. And to be as clear as possible, that probably means that this was doomed to fail everywhere because Italy had been accustomed to a highly centralized form of politics. And that's also what not what's found. And so the idea that you can't change paths once you're down one path, you just are stuck on that path, no matter how limited or destructive that path is, that's not the case either, right? And so, right, the most empowered and the least empowered thesis both seem to be disproved by the experience in Italy with this natural experiment in the 1970s and the 1980s. The third thesis is one of social and cultural primacy. Social capital, which is this idea that Robert Putnam introduces in the study and he then runs with for decades and has become one of the key terms around which whole research agendas have coalesced in contemporary political science. Social capital, understood as a generalized norm of trust, reciprocity, and engagement. When I deal with my fellow citizens, people who I don't already know, I'm not related to or friendly with, but I know that we are of the same country, that we have the same history, the same institutional setting through which we try to resolve our differences and steer our society so that it's amenable to our core interests. When I encounter a fellow anonymous citizen, do I trust them? Do I want to benefit them because I think they want to benefit me? Do I want to engage them in discussion or in activism to pursue our shared interests? And the suggestion here is that this is a critical variable, the level of social capital in explaining the success of democratic reform, and that social capital is produced and maintained through networks of civic engagement. Sorry, I don't mean to have of twice on my slide. And civic engagement, that involves participation, right? That involves actually being active with fellow citizens who we don't already know, but who we come into some sustained contact with as a result of institutions giving us the opportunity to be with them. And famously, in a later work, Putnam illustrated the kind of institution he was thinking of with a bowling league, right? It doesn't have to be a political institution. It just has to be someplace where you regularly encounter people you don't know. You come to know them, you come to trust them, you come to understand, you have some shared interests, and you care about each other. And so the conclusion of his study is that institutional reform matters, right? It succeeded everywhere in Italy, but it succeeded to varying degrees. Its impact, right, the impact of institutional reform is limited by factors that cannot be addressed through law, policy, or institutional design alone. You can't legislate higher forms of civic engagement that give rise to civic or civil, social capital. As opposed to that, you have to rely on that already being present or encourage it to develop it. You can't simply institutionalize it. And so then the second claim is that local transformation of local forms of civic practice and culture are independent and significant, and they follow their own logic and time frame. They require civic and cultural politics, which are less based in the state, especially in the central institutions of a nation state. They operate at too high a level of remove to get me to go to a bowling league, or to go to my local school council, or to participate in a unionization drive. Those are alternative and independent places where the kind of politics on which successful democratic reform develop and eventually come to have the strength, the organization, the density, and the cultural impact that allows institutional reform to succeed. I'll just very briefly say I think there's some methodological limits to what Putnam does here, limits he himself later comes to appreciate. It's probably not appropriate to assume perfect individual rationality in the way that rational choice theory does. And it does appear that Putnam, at least in his early work, was more wedded to that kind of analysis. And so this makes, right, the failure to cooperate entirely a matter of lack of mutual trust, a matter of individual rational calculation, as opposed to a more independent cultural force. The assumption that we can identify a single independent variable that explains the change. Was it the institutional reform? Was it the prior political history? Or is it the civic culture? It has to be one of those things. And perhaps the world is not so neat, is not so tidy as political science methodology wants it to be. Perhaps each of those variables is doing a little bit of the work of explanation, and that makes it hard to find the right causal equation, but perhaps better in actually understanding the messiness of the world. The other similar assumption here is that causation goes all in one way. If you've got strong civic culture, you will have successful reform. If you don't, you won't, as opposed to the possibility that maybe the reform, if done in the right way, could influence the civic culture. And so let me now just show you a little bit of the evidence that Putnam adduces for his claim, right? And so he creates an index of institutional performance. Is reform legislation actually introduced? Does it result in, for instance, new daycare centers or new housing development? Is the government relatively stable in pursuing and implementing those reforms? And I hope you can make sense of this. We have a gradation, right? And those, right, areas that are colored without any lines, those that have broad horizontal lines, those that have narrow horizontal lines are the least effective, followed by, right, the diagonal lines. It's only when you start getting crisscrossing lines or a dense cross-hashing or fully dark that you're seeing a lot of success in these metrics, right? And so there's a clear regional difference, right? And you can see it in various ways. You can see it just on the map. Clearly, the southern half of Italy does not do as well as central Italy or northern Italy in terms of reform. This is true in objective metrics, true in the way in which the population rates the success of reform as well. And so the idea that institutional design accounts for this is clearly disproved by the regional variance. The idea that modernization and the modernity of institutions should account for this also doesn't do very well. Yes, the less modern, less economically successful regions of Italy do less well, but within that box, there's not a clear relationship between more or less developed and more or less successful reforms. And that then leads Putnam to his idea of civic community and social capital. And you can see he looks at whether or not people vote in elections, in referendum, whether they read newspapers, whether they participate in cultural associations, and then he creates a scale. And please note how exact the fit is between the scale of civic engagement and the success of institutional reform. And so this leads Putnam to conclude, and these are just different ways of measuring these results, that really the success of institutional reform in Italy depended upon the prior existence of a successful and thriving civic culture. And then he suggested, right, look at the civic traditions in Italy 800 years ago, 700 years ago. Look at them 150 years ago, before fascism really took off. And what you see is a similar pattern. So this has been in place for practically a millennium. And so that means, in a sense, that we understand when reform is going to succeed and when reform is not going to succeed. And I'm going to quote to you one of my favorite passages from Tocqueville on the limits of institutional reform. And I want to suggest at this point in Putnam's career, there's a kind of fatalism about this. Again, you look at this, right? You know, the places that had their stuff together 700 years ago, the places that continued to have thriving civic cultures 150 years ago are the places that in the late 20th century have successful reform. The places that don't can't be helped. They're too far gone. This is the way Tocqueville puts it. Sometimes after 1,000 efforts, a lawgiver succeeds in exercising some indirect influence over the destiny of nations, and then his genius is praised, whereas it is often the geographic position of the country over which he has no influence, a social state which has been created without his aid, mores and ideas whose origin he does not know, and a point of departure of which he is unaware, that gives to society impetuses of irresistible force against which he struggles in vain and which sweep him to along. A lawgiver. I think we could be a little bit less elevated and say a reformer is like a man steering his route over the sea. He too can control the ship that bears him, but he cannot change its structure, create winds, or prevent the ocean stirring beneath him. And so if this is what's guiding Putnam, this wonderful metaphor from Tocqueville that says, look, you can institutionalize reform, but you can't control the culture, the geography, the history of your society. And so you are working at the margins, not changing what really needs to be changed. That seemed to be confirmed by Italy. But by the time we get to, and this is a book published just a couple years ago, I think at this point, maybe 3 years ago, that really stands as kind of the bookend on Putnam's career. Making Democracy Work was his first big book. We'll have to see. I don't know if he's working on something else right now, but he is retired. He's an emeritus professor now. And so this may be the bookend of his career. And in this most recent book, The Upswing, he makes a very different argument. And I think it's really important for orienting our understanding of our prospects for reform in 2024 in the United States. If we are like Italy, and if we've drifted into a culture of polarization, division, fracture, and also checkbook democracy, we don't participate in civic institutions anymore, then it's going to be very hard to do reform. But what Putnam argues in this most recent book is actually the United States did succeed along the path of reform quite recently. And so his argument is that the United States in the late 19th and first half of the 20th century had successful reform, and it wasn't just institutional reform. We didn't just try to change our constitution or our law or our federal government, although we did do all of that, right? In this period, we gave women the right to vote. We changed, I put that the wrong way. Women got the right to vote through their own advocacy and organization, that we succeeded in struggles to unionize our economy, that we broke up trusts and monopolies and created a much fairer economy, and that we came together politically. We became much more bipartisan, and culturally, we became much more inclusive. And so Putnam, in this diagram, right, which is essentially the diagram of the front of the cover of the book as well, suggests that there's this really striking similarity between what's happening in economics, where you go from high levels of inequality to much greater equality to much greater inequality, right? And so that's the so-called I, we, I curve. We start out individualistic and competitive. We become more solidaristic and cooperative, and then we become more individualistic and competitive again. And he suggests the same thing is true in politics, right? We start as very competitive, very partisan, very polarized. We become much more cooperative in the middle of the 20th century, and then we revert to our old patterns. In society, he suggests we started basically isolated and individualistic, and then we become more likely to join institutions that bring us together and that support a shared culture, high levels of social capital, and then we tumble back down again. And finally, at the level of culture, we start out in a very isolated, identitarian point of view, and then we become much more focused on each other and what we share in common, and then we become fractured again, right? And so to just give you a little bit of a more schematic sense of how this works, Putnam is suggesting that there are four realms that really work to potentially reinforce each other in the United States or any country being a more democratic, more cooperative, more egalitarian kind of society. Then in economics, right, we can look at the degree of inequality of income and wealth and the overall economic security of the least well off. And we have a we value and an I value, right? Equality, inequality, security, insecurity. In politics, we can look at the degree of what's sometimes called comity, our ability to work together and compromise between the parties, but also in the political culture more broadly. And here, the dichotomy is between greater cooperation and greater competition. In society, we can look at the extent of membership in associations that bring us together, religious institutions, unions, and also the stability of the family. And so the we value is cohesion, trust, having high levels of social capital, a strong social fabric, community values, because we're being brought together on a regular basis. The alternative is social fragmentation, declining trust, weakening social networks, civic privatism. And you know, one of the influential books on the late 20th, early 21st century is called The Age of Fracture. I think that's very much what Putnam is concerned that we have entered over the last 50 years in the United States. Finally, in terms of culture, the degree of solidarity or communitarianism in individual life is what we're looking at, or alternatively, right, the degree of isolation, individualism, competition. And in a culture that celebrates solidarity, there's an other orientation, right? There's an emphasis on joint responsibility and common goods. There's a celebration of the common person, right? Whereas in a more individualistic culture, there's greater narcissism, greater emphasis on just getting what's mine, right? If you saw one of the books from Putnam I've spoken with you about before is, quote, Our Kids, right? That's the title of the book. And the suggestion is that when Putnam grew up in the United States in the early 1960s, parents really were concerned not just with my kid, but with the overall well-being of the kids who their kids went to school with. And in a more narcissistic culture, our emphasis is on the individual and his or her rights and identity, just getting what is ours. And I want to go back then for a moment to this diagram and to suggest the fundamental difference in Putnam's work. I have more information to share with you, but in light of time, I want to stay at a high level of abstraction and synthesis to conclude today. And the suggestion that Putnam makes is that the fact that all of those four realms move in the same direction at the same time, we become more politically cooperative. We become more economically egalitarian. At the level of society, we become more solidaristic and more participatory. At the level of culture, we become more generous and we or other oriented. That this is not a lucky coincidence. That if two of these realms progressed in the same direction at the same time, maybe we would put it down to coincidence. But the fact that all four are so similar in their trajectory, in their development, suggests, and this is the way that Putnam puts it, that what is happening in one realm is reinforcing what's happening in another realm and being in turn reinforced by what is happening in the other realm. The fact that we're becoming more equal economically allows us to become more cooperative politically, allows us to be more trusting and joining in associational life, allows us to be more oriented to collective goods as opposed to individual goods in our culture. And so there's what he refers to as intersecting and reinforcing long-term trends, also what he calls interbraided causation. This is not the argument from Italy in which there's one thing that explains everything, right? This is a much more complicated story. And the reason I emphasize this today, let me come out of the slides and just talk with you face to face for a little while. The reason I emphasize this today is because I started the lecture, right, with the question, who should we believe? Should we believe Levitsky and Ziblatt that this is primarily about institutions that amplify the power of the minority? Or alternatively, should we believe Page and Gillen's that this is about inequality and the way in which recent Supreme Court decisions, but the overall organization of our politics allows the hyper wealthy to have too much influence? And I think what Putnam would say, in a sense, is why choose, right? Why think that it's got to be all one way or another? Last time we succeeded in making democracy work better in the United States, we didn't look for the silver bullet. We didn't look for the single solution. We did a whole bunch of stuff at the same time, at the local level, at the state level, through associations, through the kinds of sermons that ministers or rabbis were giving on a weekly basis, through the kind of music we listened to and the novels we read, and the ways in which we interacted with each other. And if we really want to repair American democracy, we can't assume that there's one lever to pull. And if we get that right, then everything else will fall into place. What is required and what is hard is a multi-front struggle, a struggle through all of our organizations, all of our domains, all of our shared culture, and the way in which we animate it with our daily activity. And so that's where I want to go as we conclude this lecture series. If we were to have a multi-front struggle to save democracy in the United States in the 21st century, what kinds of changes, what kinds of reform would that lead us to embrace? That's where we're going. Let me stop now and open it up for discussion, for thoughts, for questions. Who wants to start us out today? Flossie, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, fine, thank you.
Good. I'm remembering the 30s, how bad it was, but the promise that it could be better. One of the things that I recollect is the CCC that took the kids from all walks of life off the streets, took them out of the slums, sent them out west to work in the desert, to work in the parks, to give them a taste of what life in nature could be. And they came back home, different people, sophisticated, but having tasted a better life without causing catastrophes at home. The government paid for their transportation and their good health. And I also recollect with some degree of, with hope too, the wonderful schools we had in New York City. Mm-hmm. Especially as you left the elementary school and entered the high schools. We didn't have AP classes, but we had the regions. And how much joy some of us got, many of us got, from actually loving what we learned and trying to practice what we learned. And then not having to kill ourselves to get into a university, although some of us managed to do that on scholarship. I'm not talking about myself. Brooklyn College was brand new, and it was a lot of fun to see that college at work becoming a great school, and also having Eleanor Roosevelt dedicate the school.
Thank you, Flossie. And I'm going to start, you I think said two things. CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, right, which is an early 1930s New Deal, part of the alphabet soup, and it targeted in particular young, urban, poor men and got them doing work often in national forests and more rural environments. And I'll just point out very quickly that there are proposals to create something like a domestic Peace Corps in the United States right now. And there are some initiatives to allow recent college grads, for instance, to teach high school for a couple of years, which I think you can trace back to at least the spirit of the CCC. But I think that there are real and important opportunities to do something like this, not because we're in a depression and because the level of urban poverty is so overwhelming that we need to get the kids out of the cities, although there's a lot of that going on, right? And let's, notice that the CCC primarily benefited white or Americans of European descent, though there are exceptions to that. But we would need to do it in a more integrated way today. But two things. I think we would want there to be geographic mobility, and in particular, people from blue states going to red states and vice versa, or people from a staunch Republican background having to work with dyed-in-the-wool Democrats so that they were brought together and so that they humanized each other. That it made it less possible for them to demonize each other politically. And then the second thing, that builds on some suggestions by Michael Tomasky and others, that we create this new civil core at the domestic level. The second aspect of this, and I'll just be direct about it, we are facing looming environmental disaster. And the people who we're talking among ourselves today, we are probably not going to see the worst of it. But the people who are in their teens and 20s today, they dread what the future holds if they're looking at the projections for climate change. And to get them in a place where they could actually do constructive conservation work, where they could be, because I do think, right, part of what's going to determine how well we cope with climate change is going to be how intact the ecosystems are in a region, how diverse they are, and that in part will hopefully provide them with the resilience to cope with what is going to be a great deal of stress on the natural environment. And so I like the CCC in particular, not perhaps the way it was done in the 1930s, which was much more about electrifying or creating roads or indoor plumbing for rural communities, but as a genuine conservation effort. You spoke also about the schools in New York City in the 1930s, Flossie, and yes, that was a different era. And please remember, especially in the aftermath of World War II and with the GI Bill, the huge boom in building public colleges and universities, which Brooklyn College was at the beginning of. And the idea that in the middle of the 20th century, the United States had the most powerful economy in the world and the best wages in the world and middle class mobility and security, in part because our workforce was the best trained workforce in the world, because we had invested in public education. And I don't want to suggest that this can be repeated. I'm sorry to say that I don't think we could simply replay the script from the 1940s and the 1950s and expect it to succeed in the very different technological and economic circumstances of the middle of the 21st century. But having said that, I do think we would have much greater mobility if we had greater equality of education. And one of the scandals of our society is how expensive the investment is in preparing a child to get into a college or university. If there were good public universities that were available to people who didn't have hundreds of thousands of dollars invested in their cultivation to get them ready to compete to go to the best college, we would, I think, have much less resentment, much less sense of unfairness, much less animus against the elite, and that we would be a fairer, better, kinder society as a result. So yes, I do think that there are real things to learn from the 30s, 40s, and 50s for the 21st century, even if we can't hope to just replay the exact agenda. Thank you, Flossie. And nice to hear a little bit more of your story as well. Anybody else with a comment or a thought for today? All right, so I'm gonna let everybody go. Not wait, Renee, do you have your hand up? You're still muted.
I just wanted to say how much I'm enjoying this series. It's absolutely fascinating to me. It's a lot of work, but thank you.
That's very kind of you, and I'm sure it is a lot of work for you trying to keep track of all of this. It's a fair bit of work for me too, but it's a labor of love, and so I just want to conclude by saying, we've been doing this on Zoom for coming up unbelievably, right? But the entirety of the COVID period, right? So what is that? Coming up on 4 years now, and I just have integrated this into my schedule, my routine. My week doesn't feel complete unless I've done this. I look forward each Saturday to this being what I do with you guys. And as we get right into the heart of the holiday season, I just want to express my gratitude for you and my joy in working with you. I wish you all happy holidays. I'll look forward to seeing you next week, like every week. And be well, take care, enjoy the holidays. My thoughts will be with you. See you next week. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure as always. Take care. Bye-bye, guys.